what's actually happening.
They don't want to go up against each other and the Republican Party. I assume you're talking about the Democrats, but I think the Republicans want to keep things going as they are.
Something is buried under this valley that nobody was supposed to find, and in the next 10 minutes, you're going to watch a man risk everything he owns to dig it up. The temperature outside the Colton mining camp has dropped to 11 below zero, and the ground here doesn't just freeze, it fights back. Steel groans in the cold. Diesel turns thick in the lines. And every machine on this claim is running on borrowed time. This is Alaska in the dead of a late-season push, when most crews have already packed up and gone home for the winter. But Jesse Colton isn't most crews. He's standing at the edge of a cut that his grandfather started chasing 40 years ago and never finished. And this morning, for the first time in 4 decades, the ground is finally starting to talk. Jesse's operation is small compared to the giants of the valley. 3 excavators, 1 aging trommel plant, and a crew of 9 people who've been together long enough to finish each other's sentences. They've had rough seasons before. 2 years ago they barely broke even. Last year they lost a transmission in July and spent 6 weeks running at half capacity. But this year is different, and everyone on this crew can feel it, even if nobody wants to say it out loud yet. Because saying it out loud is how you jinx IT. IT started 3 days ago with a routine sample run along the eastern wall of the cut. A section of ground the crew had written off months earlier as low grade and not worth the fuel. Jesse almost skipped it entirely. But his foreman, a weathered old-timer named Dale Whitfield, insisted on running 1 more test line before they sealed that section for winter. Dale has been mining longer than Jesse has been alive. And when Dale says check it 1 more time, Jesse checks it 1 more time. The first sample came back strange. Not spectacular, just strange. The color of the material was different. Darker, heavier, almost black in places where the rest of the cut had been running pale gray. Anyone who's spent real time in the dirt will tell you that color change is often the first whisper that something has shifted underground. It doesn't mean gold. Not yet. But it means the story of this ground just changed chapters, and every experienced hand on site knew it the second they saw it. Then came the density. The excavator operator, a sharp young woman named Marisol Reyes who's been running bucket for 6 seasons, radioed in that the ground felt different the moment her teeth bit into it. Heavier. More resistant. The kind of load that makes an engine work just a little harder than it should for the same size bucket. She's run thousands of cuts in her career, and she said this one felt like digging into wet concrete instead of frozen till. That's not something you can measure with an instrument. That's something you feel in your hands after enough years in the seat. By the time the first real sample panned out on site, the whole crew had gathered around without anyone calling a meeting. That's how you know something's serious in this business. Not when the boss announces it, but when people stop what they're doing on their own and drift toward the same spot. What they saw in that pan wasn't outrageous. It wasn't a jackpot moment you'd see at the end of a season. But it was enough. Enough color, enough weight, enough of that unmistakable shine at the bottom of the pan to make grown adults go quiet for a few seconds. Jesse didn't celebrate. He's learned the hard way that a good pan sample and a good season are 2 very different animals. His grandfather used to say that the ground lies more often than it tells the truth. And the only way to know the difference is to keep digging and keep your expectations somewhere in the middle. So instead of popping any champagne, Jesse called for 2 more test lines to be run before anyone made a real decision about committing the whole operation to this section. Those 2 lines came back even better. And that's when the real tension of this season began. Because better numbers don't just bring hope, they bring pressure. The moment a crew sees promising ground, every subsequent decision gets heavier. Do you commit the trommel plant to this section full-time? Do you pull equipment away from other parts of the claim that were producing steady, unspectacular gold to chase something that might be bigger? Do you gamble the fuel budget, the maintenance budget, and the last 6 weeks of a short mining season on a hunch backed up by 3 good samples? For Jesse, the math was brutal. Running the plant costs the operation somewhere in the range of several $1,000s a day once you account for diesel, parts, labor, and the wear on machinery that's already past its prime. Diesel prices had climbed all season, squeezing margins that were already thin. If this section turned out to be nothing more than a rich pocket a few feet wide, they'd have burned through resources they needed for the rest of the season chasing a mirage. But if it turned out to be something bigger, a genuine, sustained layer of pay dirt running through that eastern wall. It could be the discovery that finally put the Colton operation on solid financial ground for years to come. Dale, ever the voice of caution, laid out the risk plainly to the crew one evening around the shop heater. He reminded everyone that he'd seen promising ground fool good miners before, more times than he could count. Rich near the surface, then it thins out, then it disappears entirely, and you're left holding a payroll you can't cover. He wasn't telling Jesse not to go for it. He was telling him to go for it with his eyes open, because the ground doesn't care how badly you want it to be real. Jesse spent that night walking the cut alone with a headlamp, something he does most seasons when a big decision is bearing down on him. There's a particular kind of silence in an Alaskan mine site at night, once the generators wind down and the crew has gone to bed. It's the only time Jesse really thinks clearly, away from the noise of machinery and the eyes of a crew that looks to him for certainty he doesn't always feel. Standing at the edge of that eastern wall in the dark, he thought about his grandfather, who worked this same valley for decades and passed away without ever finding the vein he always swore was down there somewhere. Jesse had spent his whole life half believing that story and half assuming it was just an old miner's tale, the kind every family in this business seems to carry. By morning, he'd made his decision. They were going all in on the eastern wall. The next few days were a blur of reorganized logistics. Jesse pulled his second excavator off a marginal section that had been producing slow but reliable gold all summer, a decision that made a few crew members nervous because reliable gold, even in small amounts, pays the bills. He redirected fuel deliveries, adjusted the crew's shift rotations to keep both machines running longer hours, and had Marisol and the other operator, a quiet but relentlessly hardworking man named Tobias Reed, start opening up a wider face along the promising layer instead of just running narrow test cuts. The work was grueling. Temperatures held in the negative digits most days, occasionally dipping low enough that hydraulic fluid thickened and machines needed extra warm-up time before they could even move properly. The crew was already tired from a long season, and now they were being asked to push harder right when their bodies wanted to slow down. But something had shifted in the camp's mood. Where there had been quiet fatigue a week earlier, there was now a current of nervous energy running through everyone. People started arriving at the shop earlier than their shifts required. Conversations over meals turned toward the same question, over and over. How big could this actually be? 6 days into the push, the crew ran their first full trommel cleanup on material pulled specifically from the widened face. The whole operation gathered at the sluice for it, the way they had for that very first pan sample. Except this time there was no pretending it was casual. Everyone knew exactly what was riding on this cleanup. The mats came up heavy. Not outrageous, not the kind of number that makes headlines, but heavy in a way that made Dale let out a low whistle he probably didn't mean to make audible. When the gold was weighed later that evening in the office, the total came in well above anything the crew had produced from a single run all season. Enough to cover a full day of operating costs several times over, with a healthy margin left on top. It wasn't a season-defining haul on its own, but it was proof. Real, weighed, undeniable proof that the eastern wall wasn't a fluke. Jesse allowed himself a small smile that evening, the first one Dale said he'd seen in weeks. But he also understood something that a newer, less experienced operator might have missed. One good cleanup doesn't make a season, and the ground still had plenty of ways to disappoint them. The layer could pinch out. It could shift depth unpredictably. It could run wide but shallow, giving them one great week before returning to ordinary numbers. Every possibility was still on the table, and Jesse knew better than to let one strong result rewrite his expectations completely. Still, the numbers over the following days told a consistent story. Cleanup after cleanup, the material coming off the eastern face kept producing well above the operation's seasonal average. It wasn't explosive, jackpot-style gold. It was steady, sustained, better-than-expected gold, run after run, and in this business, consistency over volume is often more valuable than a single spectacular strike, because consistency means the ground has real depth to it rather than a lucky pocket sitting near the surface. As word travels fast in small mining communities, a few neighboring claim holders started paying closer attention to what was happening on the Colton property. One afternoon, a longtime friend and rival operator named Hank Voss stopped by unannounced, ostensibly to borrow a spare part, but really to get a look at what all the quiet buzz around town was about. Jesse kept things professional and didn't share specific numbers. That's not something miners tend to broadcast, even to friends. But the mood on site, the extended hours, and the visible energy of the crew told Hank enough. He left with a knowing nod and a comment that Jesse would remember for a long time. Sounds like your grandfather might have been right after all. That comment hit Jesse harder than he expected. His grandfather had spent the better part of his life convinced there was a substantial vein running somewhere through this valley. A belief that some in the family had quietly treated as more sentiment than fact over the years. If this section of ground really did turn out to be an extension of what the old man had been chasing decades ago, it would mean more to Jesse than any dollar figure ever could. It would mean the stubborn old miner had been right all along, and that his grandson had been the one to finally prove it. With roughly 3 weeks left before the ground would freeze too hard to work and the season would close for good, Jesse faced the next major decision of the run. How far to push the depth of the cut. The layer they'd been working was performing well at its current depth, but early indicators, slightly increasing density readings and subtle shifts in the material composition, suggested the richest ground might actually sit somewhat deeper. Going after it would mean extending the cut walls further, increasing the risk of instability in already frozen, unpredictable soil, and committing even more of the operation's dwindling fuel and time budget to a single bet. Dale, true to form, urged caution. He pointed out that they'd already secured a genuinely strong result. More than enough to call the season a clear success regardless of what happened next. Pushing deeper risked turning a solid win into a disappointing scramble if conditions didn't cooperate, especially with winter closing in fast. But Marisol, who had spent more hours than anyone else with her hands literally on the machinery cutting into that wall, argued the opposite. She'd felt the ground continuing to change the deeper they went, and her instinct, backed by years in the seat, told her there was more down there worth finding. Jesse listened to both sides carefully, the way he always tries to before a major call. In the end, he split the difference, choosing to push the depth incrementally rather than committing everything to a single aggressive cut. It was a compromise that let the crew test the deeper ground without gambling the entire remaining season on a single roll of the dice. A decision that Dale privately admitted afterward was probably the wisest one Jesse had made all year. The deeper cuts, once opened, revealed material that was noticeably richer still. Whatever process had concentrated gold into this section of the valley over thousands of years hadn't stopped at the depth they'd already reached. If anything, the deeper layer showed even more promising signs, with heavier material and more consistent color throughout the face.